Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. I want to take this opportunity first and foremost to apologize for having not put out a podcast in a very long time. I believe it's been probably about 3 or 3.5 months since I put out episode 6 of the podcast with Oscar. And there have been some really good reasons why I haven't had time to put out a podcast in the meantime. So I want to fill you guys in on what's been going on behind the scenes, what we've been doing with the new nursery, and all of the happenings that have been going on in my life as a bonsai professional. And hopefully that will persuade you to maybe forgive me, or at least give me a little bit of leeway in not having put out a podcast in so long. So first and foremost, the nursery, Eisei-en, my nursery in Nashville, Tennessee, is progressing forward quite nicely. We are planning actually on opening the nursery on September 1st and 2nd of this year, 2018. We're going to have a big opening event. I've got Mauro Stemberger from Italy coming in to do a demonstration, actually a couple of demonstrations, one on Saturday and one on Sunday, the 1st and 2nd. And I've also got Naoki Maioka coming all the way from Japan to do the same. So it's going to be a lot of fun, very informal. We're just going to be hanging out for the weekend. It's Labor Day weekend, so it's a national holiday here in the States, so it's a 3-day weekend. But we are just going to be doing our opening on the 1st and 2nd officially, which is Saturday and Sunday. So again, very informal. We're just going to have the demos going on, maybe some live music. We'll have some drinks. Of course, everything will be on sale and for sale at that point. So if you're interested in coming out, just hanging out, saying hi, seeing what we've done with the property in terms of changing it up, turning it into our nursery Eisei-en, we would love to have you guys out. So I will be putting out information on my website as to the location with the address and everything, and some hotel information, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 weeks or so. So you can go to my site, bjornbjorholm.com, and check out all of that information, and we would love to see you guys there on September 1st and 2nd this year. The other thing that I've been working on over the last few months is finalizing and finally releasing the advanced online bonsai course that I've been putting together with Bonsai Empire. Now, in the last podcast, episode 6, I featured an interview with Oscar from Bonsai Empire, and we discussed a little bit about what was going to be in that course. But I don't think we really mentioned how long we'd been working on that course and how much effort actually went into it. So we released it on May 19th of this year, and it was almost a year to the date that we started the project, actually filming, compiling, writing, putting everything together. So it took an entire year basically to produce the advanced course. So very happy that we're finally done with it, or at least with the first half of it, which we again put out on May 19th. So if you guys are interested in signing up for that, you can go to bonsaiempire.com and you create a username and a password, and you have lifetime access to all of the material. So I'm really proud of what we did with this particular course, as a matter of fact. So I spent a long time over the last several years compiling some information about some of the historical influences and cultural influences on bonsai art, not only in Japan but around the world. And a lot of that information is contained in the online advanced course. So, some of the topics that we've kind of dived into in the podcast here are actually featured in the advanced course, but they're much more detailed, much more in-depth. And of course, you get the visual with the video that goes along with it. So I lived in Japan, as I mentioned before, for about 9 years total. And over the course of those 9 years, I compiled terabyte after terabyte after terabyte of video files, traveling around Japan, visiting places, nurseries, visiting gardens and temples and shrines and just beautiful locations around the country when I travel with my wife. And I had all this footage that I thought would be really good to throw in for the advanced course, because it really relates to a lot of the information that's covered in terms of the historical and cultural elements and the environmental factors that influence bonsai art in Japan and subsequently around the world. So if that's something that you're interested in seeing and learning about, definitely sign up for the advanced course. And of course, there are advanced techniques in there as well, everything from grafting to heavy bending to nabari development on all sorts of different species. So thank you so much for all of you guys who have signed up for that already. And if you haven't signed up for it, again, just head over to bonsaiempire.com and check that out. So in this particular podcast, I'm actually coming to you from Brazil. I'm down here for a big convention. It's actually the Brazilian National Show. I got invited down by a good group of guys here. They wanted me to come down and give a couple of demonstrations, and I'm actually here with Mauro Stemberger and Yannick Kigen from Belgium to do some demos, and it's been a blast so far. I'm actually really surprised and amazed at just how good the people here are at doing bonsai, not only the professionals, but the hobbyists. We had a competition actually on the first day of the event where all of these professionals, I think it was about 10 professionals from all over Brazil, got a tree. And they each had a separate tree, and they worked on the tree for the day, trying to turn it basically from a piece of raw material into, a nice bonsai. And Yannick and I went around and judged the trees at the end of the day. It was a nice, friendly competition, no animosity, anything like that, just a lot of fun. But the material that they were working on is spectacular. I got to kind of fill you in on what kind of material it is. So one of the guys who's hosting the event, his name is Francisco. He owns a hotel, and attached to the hotel is a bonsai nursery. In that bonsai nursery, he's been growing a very specific kind of juniper. It's Juniperus formosana. He's been growing them in the ground for 26 years. So what he did 26 years ago when these junipers were just small whips is he took them and twisted them all up into all sorts of weird contorted shapes, and he planted them in the ground in rows. He planted 400 of them. And every other year, he would twist the small branches at the base of the tree and then allow them to elongate and then twist them again, elongate, twist, and elongate. And he did that for 26 straight years. And now those trees are massive. So the tallest growth on these trees is probably 3.5 meters tall, something like that. So what's that? I don't know, 12, 15 feet tall. But at the very base of these trees, they have these crazy, gnarly, twisted trunks. And a lot of them already have natural deadwood features just from dieback or from being cut back severely. So they're very contorted, a really natural look to the trees. But the bases are huge now. I mean, some of them are up to a foot in diameter. Most of them range from about 6 to 10 inches in diameter, which is about 15 centimeters to 20 centimeters, something like that, 22 centimeters. So, really spectacular, nice big trees. But what he did was he dug a few out of the ground and grafted them with Ito Egawa foliage. And I've been working on some of those trees. Maro's been working on some. Yannick has as well. But what he did is he provided some of those trees to these professionals to do this competition. So they each got spectacular material to work with. And over the course of, I guess it took them about 10 hours yesterday, each group or each professional had their group of helpers with them, their students, and they all designed these trees over the course of 10 hours. And they all turned out spectacular. I mean, of course, some are better than others, but that's to be expected. But what we did to kind of hedge against the fact that some of the trees are a little bit lesser quality and some are really great quality, or some are more difficult to design and others are easier to design, is we actually basically divided or subtracted a certain amount of points from the trees that were easier to make or better material to start with, so we could make everything kind of even keel or on the same playing field, essentially, right from the base. And that worked out really well, because some of the trees that were really good to start with, of course, they turned out to be really great in the end, but they ended up not winning necessarily because we subtracted a certain amount of points from those. But it was about as objective as we could possibly make it, and everybody who participated was very cool about the whole process. Again, no animosity, just for fun, just having a good time. And of course, that's what bonsai is all about. So it's been a pleasure to be down here. I'll be here for another couple of days for this event, and then I'm heading to Sao Paulo to work with a group of guys for the rest of the week down there. So just doing some workshops and hanging out. So that's pretty much been my schedule since the last time I talked to you guys. I was in India talking to Oscar last time. We were at a big convention there, flew straight from there to Spain. Then from there I went to France, then back to the States. And in the last, I guess maybe 6-7 weeks, I've hit up probably 12 or 15 states throughout the U.S., traveling and teaching. So that's another reason why the last podcast was so long ago, and I haven't had time to do another one. So when I initially put out the podcast, the very first episode, I told you guys that I want to try to put out an episode every other week. And of course, I haven't been able to do that, so I apologize. But going forward, I'm going to try my best to make up for that and stick with the every other week schedule. I'm still traveling like mad, and we're still setting up the nursery. So there might be a time here and there where I can't get an episode out, but I'm going to try my best to make sure that happens. So, the support that I've gotten from you guys so far on the podcast has been fantastic as well. So I really appreciate that. And the questions you've been sending me have been great. And we'll get into the mailbag later in this episode as well. Answer some of your questions that you've sent in. So I'm excited to do that as well. So for this particular podcast, I thought it might be interesting to take a look at one of my favorite books of all times. It's not a bonsai book per se, but it relates a lot to bonsai art and design. It's a book by a fella named Donald Richie, and it's called A Tractate on Japanese Aesthetics. Now, some of the information that we've talked about in previous episodes of the podcast, the information has come sort of tangentially from this book, but I actually want to go through and take this book chapter by chapter, not all in one episode, of course, but over the course of several episodes, and talk about each chapter individually and kind of what that information means as it relates to bonsai art. So I think probably the best place to start with this book is just to kind of give you a background of the author of the book. It's a really interesting guy. His name's Donald Richie. He was born in 1924. He was actually born in the U.S., but he spent his whole career writing about Japanese people, Japanese culture, and really he was mostly famous for writing about Japanese cinema. But he actually moved to Japan and lived in Japan for decades, writing about cinema and culture and the people of Japan. And this particular book, A Tractate on Japanese Aesthetics, is sort of the culmination of all of his time in Japan and his experience in Japan, speaking about aesthetics, which is a really difficult subject to verbalize and to pin down and to put into sort of any concise format. So this book is something that I've read probably, 10, 15 times all the way through. You can get it on Amazon. It's actually a very short book. I've got it right here. Let me see how many pages it's got in it. Yeah, it's only like 70 pages or so. Oh, by the way, if you hear some noise in the background, I'm in the hotel in Brazil, so it's very echoey here, and there's a lot of people opening and closing doors. So I'll try to cut some of that sound out later in post with the podcast. But if you do hear that, I apologize. So yeah, but the book is only about 70 pages, 75 pages long, 73 pages. No, there's a dictionary in the back. So 70 pages exactly. So it's a very short book, but there's a boatload of information contained in this book. And it's a fascinating read. So I think probably the best way to do this is really to start with the preface of the book and actually read whole passages of this book, and then we'll sort of analyze it together and talk about it as it relates to bonsai art and design. So we're just going to start with the preface of this book, and I'm not going to read every single sentence in here. We'll skip certain paragraphs. There's copyright issues as well with reading too much of this, so I don't want to do that. But I do want to give you sort of the most important portions of the book, in my opinion. So starting with the preface of the book, Donald Richie says, "In writing about traditional Asian aesthetics, the conventions of a Western discourse, order, logical progression, symmetry, impose upon the subject an aspect that does not belong to it. Among other ideas, Eastern aesthetics suggests that ordered structure contrives, that logical exposition falsifies, and that linear consecutive argument eventually limits." So basically what he's saying here is it's very hard to pin down what the word aesthetics actually means, and particularly when you're talking about Asian aesthetics, it becomes even more difficult because the way that folks generally in Asia, particularly in Japan, sort of think about how to analyze things, it's not really at all direct. Same thing with the language. It's a very indirect sort of contextual way of discussing things. A lot of the terms that are used in aesthetics he'll cover later in this book, but you can really understand what I mean when we talk about those terms because they're these big sort of numinous, large terms that don't really have an exact meaning to them. But they express sort of a larger feeling. He's really just setting the book up to explain that it's putting something like this together is very difficult. And when we talk about bonsai art, it's also difficult to speak about bonsai art in a way that's or at least to discuss bonsai art in a way that makes it easy for folks to understand. So, for example, when I traveled around the world and I teach about sort of my approach to design in bonsai art, I try to be as objective as possible in explaining at least my thought process in how I design a tree. So, starting with the base, this is why I value this is why I don't value that, this is why I want to show this off, this is why I want to hide that. I try to be objective about it so people can understand where I'm coming from. But that being said, it's still a difficult process to explain. But we're going to get a little bit further into this book, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up on some of the nuance. Donald Richie continues in the preface, most likely to succeed in defining Japanese aesthetics is a net of associations composed of listings or jottings, connected intuitively, that fills in a background and renders the subject visible. Hence the Japanese uses for juxtaposition, for assembling, for bricolage. In any event, for any consideration of aesthetics, east or west, the quality of apprehension is sensibility, an awareness, a consciousness, a sensitivity. It is alive and often unfriendly to interpretation, and if it is to be pinned down to the page, then feints and indirections are some of the means. We thus should not strive for logical conclusions. Rather, we ought to define those perceptions and variances of aesthetic appreciation through a style that conveys something of the very uncertainty of their description. Many Japanese writers prize a quality of indecision in the structure of their work, and something too logical, too symmetrical is successfully avoided when writers ignore the suppositions of the questions asked of them. It is then not the assumptions of the writer's controlling mind that are followed, but, as the Japanese phrase it, the brush itself. Zuihitsu, the Japanese word we might translate as essay, implies just that, following the brush, allowing it to lead. The structure is the multiplicity of strokes that make up the aesthetic quality, one which they imply and which we infer. In this book, I, Donald Richie, have sought to approximate this neglect of logical method, this dismissal of linear structure, and both in the text and its placement on the page, I have attempted to give some idea of the progression of a zuihitsu. So in other words, the way that Donald Richie is writing this book is in a format called zuihitsu, which is basically sort of like train of thought. So he's just going to jot down whatever comes to his head as it relates to Japanese aesthetics and design, and however that sort of plays out on the page, that's what he's got. So I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast that I was going to talk about this book in chapters. I really shouldn't have said it that way because this book isn't broken down into chapters. It's sort of one long, giant train of thought. So we're going to have to sort of pick and choose where we stop and where we start each episode when we're talking about this book so that it flows as best as possible. But there are no actual chapters like 1, 2, 3, 4 within this book. And I think he's very right in writing a book about aesthetics using that type of format because, like he says, once you start breaking things into categories, it almost necessarily limits you or puts limitations on the way you think about aesthetics and the way you think about design. It's exactly the same thing in bonsai. So, there's some very famous books from back in the day. One of my all-time favorite books was, John Naka's Bonsai Techniques 1 and 2. And I think a lot of us, I would say probably a majority of us in the bonsai world have those books in our library, and they may have been really the very first books that we ever had. They were great books in terms of giving you kind of a general outline and a guideline as to how to get into bonsai, how to design sort of your basic tree with, the S curve and the branch, 1, 2, 3, 4, kind of in a spiral up the tree. And you use those patterns to create kind of a basic design. But the problem with sort of discussing bonsai in that way is that it really necessarily limits you and puts limitations on your ability to design. So, when we take tours, and my wife and I take tours to Japan and bring people from overseas to Japan for the first time, one of the main things that people say to us every time is they're just amazed at how many of the quote unquote rules are broken in Japanese bonsai. We'll go to the kokufu, for example, and they'll look up under the trees and look at the structure of the branches, and they'll see crossing branches, or they'll see bar branches, or they'll see inverse taper, or things that normally would fall under, the bad category if you're talking about the rules of bonsai as dictated by those old books. But that's the problem, again, with labeling things and being too specific and putting everything into a category. It makes for a great way to learn, and it makes it very easy for someone like myself to teach if we put things into categories, but it necessarily limits you in terms of your ability to sort of step outside the box and create and design and really understand aesthetics. So I think the way Donald Richie has put this book together is a perfect example of how we should really think about bonsai design as well. So when we're creating a tree, almost think of it as writing an essay in the tree, right? And using that form zuihitsu of essay writing, sort of free form, train of thought type approach to designing your trees. That doesn't mean everything should be whimsical and crazy and weird, but it means that you should take a step back and stop thinking too much about the rules. Understand the techniques, understand the basics, and then from there, write your essay in the tree. Approach it as a zuihitsu. All right, so this is the opening of the actual book itself. So we've just finished the preface, and we'll get into the very first opening chunk of the book right here. So this is the meat and potatoes of the book. So Donald Richie says, aesthetics is that branch of philosophy defining beauty and the beautiful, how it can be recognized, ascertained, judged. In the West, the term was first used in 1750 to describe a science of sensuous knowledge. Its goal was beauty, in contrast with logic, whose goal was truth. Based upon dichotomies, i.e. beauty, truth, aesthetics, logic, the definition was elaborated into a multifaceted concept assuming that opposites and alternates lead to an aesthetic result. The conjectures and conclusions were those of 18th century Europe, but are still common today. There are, however, different criteria at different times in different cultures. Many in Asia, for example, do not subscribe to general dichotomies in expressing thought. Japan makes much less of the body-mind self-group formation, with often marked consequences. Here we would notice that what we would call Japanese aesthetics, in contrast to Western aesthetics, is more concerned with process than with product, with the actual construction of a self rather than with self-expression. So let's take a step back here and think about this for just a second. So in a previous episode of the podcast, we talked about some of the cultural influences that have influenced the modern manifestation of bonsai art in Japan. And one of those was long-term orientation. And because of the long-term orientation of Japanese society as a whole, people focus more on creating something in the long run, and that process of getting there is more important than the actual end product itself. I think we talked in specific about deciduous material, where you apply a technique year after year after year, and you get this sort of incremental change in the tree, and every step in that process is absolutely necessary to get to the end result at 20 years or 30 years down the line, where you have a beautifully ramified tree with no scarring on the trunk, a perfect nabari if that's something you value. So to get to that end result, every step in the process has to be done just right. And this is exactly what Donald Richie is talking about. So there's more of an emphasis in Japan, and in particular in Japanese aesthetics, focusing on the actual construction of the product rather than the product itself. So let's get back to the text here. Donald Richie says, the Western concept finds beauty in something we admire for itself rather than for its uses, something that the philosopher Immanuel Kant called purposiveness without a purpose. Traditional Japan emphasizes differently. It is closer to such pre-Enlightenment European definitions as Chaucer's beauté apparente to grace. Just a side note here, I know I totally butchered that, but basically what that means is where the grace of the fitness excites intellectuals or moral pleasure and gives rise to the concept of social approval in the form of good taste. Between good sense and good taste, there is the same difference as between cause and effect, an observation with which Chaucer, as well as the aesthetically traditional Japanese, might have agreed. In matters aesthetic, taste remains an observation of deserved worth, and that should take care of that, except that we are not all agreed as to what good sense consists of. Some countries say one thing, some say another. The Japanese traditionally maintain that we have been given a standard to use. It is there, handy, daily, things as they are, or nature itself. This makes good sense, the only sense really. Nature should be our model. We are to regard it, to learn from it. As the attestician Ueda Makoto has said, in pre-modern Japanese aesthetics, the distance between art and nature was considerably shorter than in its Western counterparts. Elsewhere in Europe, even sometimes in China, nature as guide was there, but its role was restricted to mimesis, realistic reproduction. In Japan, this was traditionally not enough. It was as though there was an agreement that the nature of capital nature could not be presented through literal description. It could only be suggested, and the more subtle the suggestion, think haiku, for example, the more tasteful the work of art. All right, so let's take a step back here and think about this as it relates to bonsai art and design. The quote that really stood out to me was the one that Donald Richie put in here by a fellow named Ueda Makoto, who said, in pre-modern Japanese aesthetics, the distance between art and nature was considerably shorter than in its Western counterparts. So, if you really take a look at what's considered art in Japan and what's considered beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, it's very subtle colors, very subtle movements. Even in dance, the movements are very subtle. With tea bowls that are quite often considered works of art, the most sought after are not the ones that are covered in gold. They're the ones that are made with natural materials that appear natural, that are very subtle and beautiful and subdued in their color palettes. And you see the same thing in bonsai art and design in Japan. Subtlety is a huge thing. It's probably one of the biggest things in how different artists approach an individual tree. So I've mentioned this in podcasts before, but if you look at juniper style from several different nurseries, they may all appear to be the same, but the subtle difference between each artist becomes very apparent when you really study and understand and know what you're looking at, and particularly in the context of Japanese aesthetics. That's where the beauty actually lies, is in the subtle differences. It's not in being loud. It's not in being forceful and in pushing your agenda or your opinion on the work of art or trying to show your ego in the work of art. It's the sort of the work of art itself. It's completely egoless, or it should be egoless. And then, the subtle differences between artists, that's where the fascinating aspect or element of bonsai art and aesthetics and design really come into play. So, when you look at it in a Western context, those things get lost quite often. You'll hear people say, bonsai in Japan is very cookie cutter. They follow all these rules, and, if anything falls outside of the norm, it's shut down. That's not really true. It's just that there are these incremental changes and very subtle changes and subtle differences between artists and between people making trees. And it's really taking nature, something from nature itself, obviously, creating an idealized version of that in bonsai art, because we do manipulate branches quite heavily. We do move them into radically different places to frame certain things and show certain things off, or hide other, negative aspects or demerits of the tree. Of course we do that. But it's not done in such a contrived way that it ends up looking unnatural, or that the true sort of natural beauty of that piece of plant material is completely lost in the process. So again, you see it through all aspects of art in Japan. There's a focus on being natural, or leaving it in its natural state, and sometimes even highlighting flaws that are natural. And this is where you get terms like wabi-sabi, which we'll cover a bit later in this book when Donald Richie gets into those subjects. So back to the text. Here, Japanese arts and crafts, a division that the pre-modern Japanese did not themselves observe, imitated the means of nature rather than its results. One of these means was simplicity. See, here we go. There is nothing merely ornate about nature. Every branch, twig, or leaf counts, showing structure, emphasizing texture, even boldly displaying an almost ostentatious lack of artifice. This was what the Japanese learned to do. Such simplicity was to be delineated by a number of categories. For example, wabi and sabi, those conjoined twins of Japanese aesthetics that we will later visit. One result was that, as a prerequisite for taste, this simplicity was found beautiful. See, there you go. So simplicity is really the key in Japanese aesthetics and really in understanding bonsai art and design. And we're going to dive a lot deeper, actually, into what this means, the term simplicity, how it applies to bonsai art, and those terms like wabi-sabi that were just mentioned in the text here in a future episode of the podcast. So I just wanted to give you kind of a cursory introduction to this text. It may be a little hard to follow as I read it. So if you want to buy this book and actually read along in the text with me, I recommend that you do that. The book is only, it's $10. You can get it on Amazon or any online outlet and get it shipped to you. But I recommend that you get this book and you read along with me because, at least for me, it helps to have a visual with the text in front of me and then to follow along as I read it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. We're going to get a lot deeper into the text of this book and into the sort of side stories that Donald Richie dives into as little tangents off to the side. But each of those is going to add, I think, to the conversation overall about aesthetics in general and particularly about bonsai art and design. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. But now what we're going to do is jump into to the mailbag because I've got a backlog of a ton of questions from you guys from previous episodes of the podcast. So let's do that right now. Okay, so the first question comes from Wim Deca. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I'm just going to read the whole email so you guys can get the general context here. They say, I have heard you talk about the different ways of approaching deciduous bonsai material, especially when comparing the West to Japan. In the West, a lot of deciduous trees are started from a thick, trunk-chopped base, sometimes labeled with the, in my opinion, horrible terms Urbandori and even Yardadori. I haven't heard that one before. That one's new for me. Subsequently, these trees then get a new apex and set of branches that will likely never blend into the tree and create a harmonious whole. To me, this method of doing bonsai feels like a desperate attempt to want to reinvent bonsai for the purpose of being different from the Japanese traditions. Yet I feel like the reasons why this isn't common in Japan are obvious. It's like inventing a square wheel and stubbornly committing to using it only because it's your invention. All just because you don't want to admit the centuries of experience and experimentation someone else did could have resulted in something superior. To make a long story short, I was curious to know if there are any deciduous Yamadori trees in Japan, and if so, how they are then subsequently trained and what the final results could look like. Okay, so it's a really good question. I agree with your general premise about in the West people wanting to have the big fat trunk look to the trees, just a nice sort of general outline or sort of silhouette of the tree, but nothing in terms of actual quality with the taper and scarless trunk like we talked about before, beautiful ramification. It just seems to be instant gratification. So the fastest way to get to a fat trunk, forgetting about all of the details along the way, which we've discussed in previous podcasts. So I'm on the same page as you about that. So to answer your question, though, about whether or not there are deciduous Yamadori trees in Japan, technically not really. So the only thing that gets really close to it would be, for example, Prunus Mume or Japanese flowering apricots. So I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of those in either my videos or, of course, in the Kokofu books or any of the Japanese exhibition books. Prunus Mume tend to have really gnarly, twisted trunks with crazy deadwood on the trunks, almost like a live vein type look. But it's not typically white. It's usually kind of a grayish, very subdued deadwood color, and then you've got the really dark, almost black, craggy bark of the live veins. A lot of those trees are actually collected out of gardens. They're planted in gardens decades and decades and decades ago, and over time they start to, portions of them start to die off. Big branches will die off. They'll lose some of the live tissue on the trunk, and then you get this really hard, gnarly deadwood. Most of those come from gardens, so people have planted them in their gardens, and then they've collected them out of there. Really, Prunus Mume were actually imported from China originally, and there's actually some really cool history about this. So in the Nara period, the Nara Jidai, they say in Japanese, which was between 710 and 794 AD, or CE technically, Common Era, that's when a lot of stuff from mainland Asia, particularly from China and from Korea, was being brought over to Japan. There was a huge influx of art and culture and architecture and, of course, plant material. But there's a lot of existing documentation and records of the plant material that was brought over, and a majority of it, or a lot of it, or what was really popular at that time, was Prunus Mume. So those plants would have been brought over in pots, obviously. And really, if you really think about it, those would have been sort of the first iteration of, I guess you could call it bonsai, if you want to be loose with the term, in terms of it being a plant in a pot, being brought over for aesthetic purposes. Now, whether or not these trees were pruned in an aesthetic way is, it's kind of left to speculation, I guess. But the fact that they were brought over during that period as potted plants to be enjoyed, for aesthetic reasons, for the flowers, is really sort of the first iteration of bonsai being brought from China and Korea to Japan. So, that being said, my point is that any of the flowering apricots that are in Japan now would have been imported, or, are generations after those that would have been imported during the Nara period. So there might be some that have sprouted in the mountains around Japan, but that's pretty rare. It's not like they've become sort of a ubiquitous thing that grows in the mountains. Those are the cherry trees, the The actual cherries that are native to Japan, you'll see those all over the place in the mountains. But in terms of Prunus Mume, Japanese flowering apricots, those are grown in gardens. And you'll see them in temples, you'll see them in shrines, really nice, old, big, gnarly ones with crazy deadwood on them. And of course, you'll see smaller ones sort of scattered about. So a majority of the bonsai that are made from Prunus Mume are going to be collected from the garden. So, technically, I guess you could call them urban dori or yardadori, as you say. Those terms annoy me as well, so we'll set those aside. But they are collected out of gardens. So in terms of the other deciduous trees that you see in Japan, nothing's really coming off the top of my head here in terms of what would be collected in the mountains and then grown as bonsai. Even cherry trees that I just mentioned, which are native to Japan and they're sort of ubiquitous in the mountains, are everywhere. Those typically are not collected out of the mountains and then planted in pots and cultivated as bonsai. Those trees that are made into bonsai as cherry trees, which are pretty rare, those are usually grown from cuttings or from air layers or from seedlings and then developed into bonsai. So we actually have one at Fujikawa-san's nursery. It's the biggest cherry I've ever seen as a bonsai. It's been there, I think since probably 1978 or 1980. It's been there forever. But it was actually surprisingly imported from Korea. So it was field grown in Korea. The trunk on it's probably 3 times the size of my waist. It's huge. We actually have to use a pulley system to raise and lower the tree when we repot it in the spring. And it takes 4 or 5 of us at least to lift it up, work on the roots, and then repot it. But that tree was field grown in Korea, then brought over to Japan, and then the branches were subsequently developed by Fujikawa-san's father, Minoru Fujikawa, and then Keiichi Fujikawa's son, my teacher, my oyakata. But that's really the only one that I can think of that. Technically it's not Yamadori, it's field grown, but it wasn't exclusively container grown. It was grown in the field. So, other than that, I really can't think of anything that's deciduous that would have been grown in the mountains and collected as Yamadori. It's pretty rare. That being said, we do have a lot of stuff here in the States, deciduous material that could be collected out of fields and grown as bonsai. So, for example, the winged elm that we have down south, those really actually do really well with slicing the trunks and developing a new top to them and trying to develop taper. If you do it properly, you can really hide the scar, get it to heal over. The bark will start to fissure up and really cover that up over time. So it is possible to develop something like that. It's just a much more difficult process. Whereas if you were to, say, air layer some of the branches off of a tree like that in nature, you can get a nice radial nabari, and then you can start the process, growing them in a container, say like a wooden box or something like we discussed before, and training them long-term that way to get the perfect taper, get the kind of movement that you want, have a relatively scarless trunk, and develop nice ramification. All right, so the second question in this podcast comes from Rafael Najmanovic. Again, I'm sorry if I butcher your name. I'm going to read you guys again the whole email so you get the full context. He says, I admire your work, but after listening to your last podcast, episode 5, so this would have been a couple podcasts ago, I felt compelled to write you. I heard you express reservations against phoenix graft, and in the same podcast express support for grafting Shinpaku foliage on Yamadori Rocky Mountain junipers. I find this inconsistent. Having fake live foliage in a tree is fine, but having a tree planted on a groove of a deadwood piece with character is not. If phoenix graft is not allowed, then what about root over rock or any other composition that contains anything other than the tree? I also think that if a tree was taken from nature and it survived and it is old and full of character, the last thing we're allowed to do out of respect for that living organism is to replace its foliage by grafting something else. If one doesn't like the foliage in that 300-year-old juniper or pine, then I'd say leave it alone and find another one. I feel more insulted by grafting different species. Grafting from the same tree is fine, in his opinion, than the phoenix graft. Another way to look at phoenix graft is that you're giving a new life to a piece of deadwood as part of an art composition. Okay, all right, so that's a great question. Totally understand where you're coming from. So let's address what I talked about before in terms of phoenix graft. So phoenix graft in Japan, they call it Tanuki. And we talked about the meaning of this before, but just to reiterate the point, Tanuki is basically a raccoon dog. And in Japanese folklore, that raccoon dog is supposed to be very devious and very mischievous. And his goal is to trick the audience in whatever capacity he's planning to trick them in, whether that be to take their money or to make them do something silly or, just to make a fool of them. So that's why bonsai with dead wood and a live tree attached to that is called a tanuki, because the goal is to trick the audience. Now, the reason I have an issue with tanuki, but I don't have an issue with grafting live foliage onto, changing the foliage type on a tree, say changing Rocky Mountain juniper foliage through grafting Itoigawa into an Itoigawa tree. The reason that I find tanuki different than that is because in Japan, we'll just use Japan as a context here. So in Japan, trees, species, and styles will sort of come in waves in terms of their popularity. So, for example, in the early 80s, formal upright Japanese black pines were really popular. Japanese maples were really popular. Stewardia were popular. But if you look at the market now, all of those trees have gone way down in value. Whereas if you look at, say, for example, Elaeagnus, those really weren't that popular, say, in the 80s. But if you can find a really good one right now, they're crazy expensive, right? So they come in waves, and a lot of that has to do with supply and demand. If there's enough supply to meet the demand, then the price goes down, and vice versa in the opposite context. So in regards to juniper bonsai, they are, and particularly Itoigawa juniper bonsai, they are the only trees in Japan that appreciate consistently over time. Right. So if you look at the trajectory of prices of juniper bonsai, Itoigawa in particular collected Yamadori Itoigawa juniper in Japan from the time they started to get popular, say in the early 20th century, up until now, they continually appreciate in value. Now, people who are making tanuki to trick the audience, the goal is to try to sell those trees to someone to make a major profit on it, because they know that collecting Yamadori Itoigawa trees from the mountains with crazy deadwood and that live wood twisting characteristic in the tree is going to sell for a very high price, much higher price than what you'd see, say, a field-grown Itoigawa sold for, because they're rare. So there are some really good examples in Japan of really, really, really good phoenix grafts that are really hard to tell. But again, those were created with the intention of trying to sell them, or at some point, somebody's going to get a hold of them and try to sell them to somebody for a high profit, because these are the trees, again, that appreciate over time. So for me, there's just an added layer of dubiousness in that regard, in terms of tricking someone into paying a high price for a tree. So that's why I have such an aversion to that. Okay, so on the flip side of that, the reason that I don't mind or don't have an aversion to changing the foliage type on a tree. So say, for example, taking a Tohoku Shinpaku in Japan, which has long, leggy, gross foliage, but maybe really nice deadwood characteristics, and grafting, say, Itoigawa foliage onto it, which is a much finer, tighter, more compact foliage, is for a couple of reasons. So first and foremost, it's done for practical reasons. What I mean by that is that long, leggy foliage on a Tohoku Shinpaku, for example, doesn't matter how much you work with that. You're going to wire it, and within 2 to 3 weeks, it's going to flop, and you're going to have to wire it again, and it's going to flop, and you're going to have to wire it again, and it's going to flop. It'll never look very good. You're going to be working it too much. You're going to be damaging the tree over time because you're working it too much to get the look that you're trying to go for. So in order to make a more compact, tighter, better looking tree overall, grafting Itoigawa, for example, is a much better option, because you can graft that foliage, you can change the foliage type completely, the tree is still alive, but you've got a nice, compact, easily developable, if that's a word, or easy to develop type foliage. It's going to sit in position, and you're not going to have to consistently and constantly keep wiring it. So for practical reasons, that's why I'd prefer to work with, say, Itoigawa rather than Tohoku. Same thing in the States. If you go out and collect a Rocky Mountain juniper, for example, you could have everything from really fine foliage all the way to really crappy foliage. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the really crappy foliage. So you're going to be having to wire it, and it's going to flop, and you have to wire it, and it's going to flop. So for practical reasons, it just makes more sense to graft something that's going to be easier to develop, that's going to look better in the long run, and it's going to require less time in terms of having to maintain that foliage to keep that nice, consistent look to it. So that being said, what I would really like to see is sort of what's happened in Japan with Itoigawa. So let's take Itoigawa, for example, here. Again, just like Rocky Mountain junipers, you have the full spectrum from coarse to fine with Itoigawa foliage. So what they've done in Japan is a lot of the trees that get collected in the mountains, Itoigawa Shinpaku, they may have really long, ugly, coarse foliage. But what they've done is they've found anomalies in the mountains of Itoigawa that have really nice fine foliage. And they've taken that fine foliage, cultivated it through taking cuttings, so you get a genetic match, or genetically identical material, propagated that, figured out how to cultivate that, make it finer and finer and finer. And they use that material to graft back on to Itoigawa. Right, so you're grafting cultivated Itoigawa back onto natural Itoigawa. So does that mean you're changing it? Does that mean you're changing the species? Does that mean, should that be avoided? Is that dubious? Well, in my opinion, not at all. And actually, that would be a preferred way to do it. So what I would like to see in the States is someone actually go out in the mountains, someone who collects, say, Rocky Mountain junipers, for example, search for witch's broom or search for some sort of genetic anomaly, propagate that, not through seeds, but through cutting, so you get a genetic match, propagate that, cultivate that, and try to develop a nice, fine Rocky Mountain juniper foliage that then we can graft back onto the Rockies. So that way, you can say it's pure or purer in that regard, if that's something that you're really concerned with. But the whole point is that it's more practical, that you're not going to have to wire it and unwire it and wire it and rewire it. And you're actually working the foliage less than you would if the foliage type was crappy to begin with. So for me, the fact that a Tanuki is made in Japan because people know that a naturally occurring beautiful deadwood tree with beautiful live vein interplay with it sells for a high price and consistently goes up in price. For me, that's what makes me averse to creating something like a Tanuki, because the goal is to trick somebody into buying that. Now, that being said, if you were to take, again, the Tohoku Shinpaku in Japan with the crappy foliage and graft Itoigawa foliage onto it, the price of that tree as an Itoigawa graft is going to be higher than it was as a Tohoku. But the reason it's going to be higher is not because the tree is sold as an Itoigawa. It's still sold as a grafted Tohoku with Itoigawa foliage on it. But the reason it's higher in value is because people place more value on trees with Itoigawa foliage because they're practical and easier to maintain, and they look more beautiful over time. So the fact that the trees go up in value, in this case, doesn't matter to me. It doesn't make me averse to doing it, or it doesn't make me think less of the tree because it's done for practical reasons, and it's explained to the customer, whoever's buying it, that it's a grafted tree. And anyone can tell that it's grafted. I mean, come on, it's pretty obvious. If you're spending money on trees like that, particularly at that level, you're going to know what you're buying, right? So I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, but if you're looking at, say, for example, a Tohoku Shinpaku that has, nice chunky deadwood on it, and it's grafted with Itoigawa or cultivated Itoigawa foliage, it's incredibly obvious that it's grafted, because you won't see that type of fine Itoigawa foliage in nature, again, because it's cultivated. It's not a variety, it's cultivated. And the contrast between the fine foliage on that Itoigawa and the chunky deadwood of the Tohoku is actually quite a stark contrast. So it's pretty obvious that that's not a naturally occurring foliage type on the tree. So, even if there was somebody dubious that was trying to sell it to you as a naturally collected Itoigawa tree, it's pretty obvious that that's not the case, particularly if you're spending big bucks on a tree at that level. And really, I have never, ever, ever come across a professional in Japan or elsewhere trying to sell an Itoigawa that was grafted onto something else as an Itoigawa. It'll be said that it's an Itoigawa in terms of the foliage type, but it'll also be explained what the base material is. So that's really why I'm averse to making Tanuki and selling Tanuki, because you're cheating. You're basically cheating, right? You're making a tree appear as if it's an old collected tree. You're lying to the audience about it, and that's that. Whereas, again, with the grafted trees, it's all for practical reasons, and it gives you a much more beautiful look in the long run. So aesthetics and practicality. Now, you may disagree with that, and that's totally fine. And you may think that's hypocritical, and that's totally fine. But I'm going to enjoy working on my Itoigawa grafted onto Rocky Mountain junipers rather than having to wire my Rocky Mountain juniper crappy foliage every 2 weeks. So you can keep wiring yours. I'm going to let mine grow, and I'm going to enjoy mine. So that's just my opinion. And if you don't like it, that's fine. We can agree to disagree. So we will make this the final question for this particular mailbag. This one comes from Omar Adasi, and Omar is from New York City. Okay, so I'm going to, again, read you the entire email so you get the full context here. So it says, from reading Wikipedia, there's a broad definition that bonsai is more structured than Penjing, and that the latter uses more landscapes and water elements. There's another broad stroke idea that in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, styles tend to include model making and miniatures. I'd love to hear what you know about the way styles shift throughout Asia. The cultural and economic elements of your show have been fascinating, and after hearing how bonsai was viewed as an economic opportunity during the Japanese economic bubble in the 80s, I wonder if there's a similar boom of interest in Penjing happening today in China. I know the Chinese government has been active in funding gardens in the U.S. In much the same way the Japanese government used bonsai as a diplomatic gift in the 1970s. Okay, yeah, this is a great topic, great question. So let's jump back to the first part of the question, which was in regards to the styles throughout Asia. So as a general rule of thumb, that stuff that you read on Wikipedia is actually relatively accurate, in terms of bonsai being a bit more structured than Penjing. And what I'll say about that, though, is that if you look at the different schools of Penjing throughout China, there's one in particular, I think it's called the Lingnang School of Penjing. I might be pronouncing that wrong. But it's a very interesting, almost kind of angular look to the trees. It's very unique. And the trees tend to be, they tend to be a little bit skinnier and thinner, so not these big massive trunks, but, I guess you could say they sort of fall more into the literati type style, but I don't really think that's a great classification for those. But it's a very specific style, very specific school of bonsai in China. Those are really fascinating, very different than anything else that I've seen anywhere in the world. But as a general rule of thumb, at least up until relatively recently, Penjing have been, a bit more, Penjing are really actually landscapes. Pensai is a little bit different. It's more like bonsai is a single plant in a pot. Now, those of you who speak Chinese out there who know a bit more about this than I do, I'm probably going to get some angry letters from you and saying that I'm totally wrong about this, but this is just sort of my general perception of it. So, but as a general rule of thumb, up until relatively recently, yes, that's been the case, that Penjing has been and Pensai have been a little bit less structured, so to speak, than Japanese-style bonsai or bonsai in Japan. Now, what's been shifting lately is because the economy in China is booming right now. It's growing by leaps and bounds. It's just blowing up. You're seeing a similar effect there as you saw in Japan in the 1980s during the bubble period. So what I mean by that is there's a lot more income available, disposable income in particular, available to the general public. So that means that there's a lot more money available to spend on hobbies and art and things that you normally wouldn't spend your money on unless you had that extra money. And Penjing and Pensai are part of that. So what I've noticed over the last few years in going to China, I head to China about every year and a half or so. My wife's from China. Her family still lives in China, so we go to visit them quite often. And then, of course, I do conventions in China every once in a while, too. But what I've noticed over the last, I would say probably 7 or 8 years, maybe even longer than that, maybe even up to 9 or 10 years, is that every time I go to China, I see a lot of the same trees each time I go. At the conventions in particular, they'll have exhibitions there, and I'll see these same trees. But what I've noticed is the style of the planting, say, for example, Penjing, that are the landscape type plantings, they're still planted the same way, but the development of the trees within those plantings has gotten so much more detailed and refined. So you're starting to see a similar effect that you saw in Japan, say between like 1978 and 1985, 88. So, kind of that 10-year period there, 78 to 88, where you saw an increase in, detail wiring, refinement techniques, developing deciduous trees to get that nice soft ramification, attention to detail. And all of that, in my opinion, has to do with all of this extra income available that people are spending on these hobbies, and all of these businesses, bonsai is a business. So all of these businesses noticing that and trying to differentiate the product. And in bonsai, that means more detail, right? Or it manifests itself in terms of more detail. So you're starting to see that similar effect. So it's really cool where you get, that old school sort of Penjing, what you would expect to be a Penjing style in terms of the planting, with the rocks kind of glued in the ceramic basins, the marble basins, like what you saw with, there's a very famous guy named Brook Zhao. is a Chinese fella. He wrote a book called Penjing, Worlds of Wonder back in the 90s, I think it was. I used to carry his book around at school, in high school, and I would get picked on constantly for doing so, but it was one of my favorite books. And if you go back and look at the trees in that book, and you look at those same trees now, the development of the actual trees, the quality of detail, the focus on ramification, is completely different. So you're seeing almost like this melding, almost like a melding of styles between Japan and China, where China is still maintaining that sort of base Penjing type style, but the quality of the trees is starting to look more Japanese. So if you were to take those trees, say, out of those plantings, put them in a traditional style pot like what you would see in Japan, those trees could easily go in the kokofu and they wouldn't be out of place at all. So it's really interesting to see that type of development in China now. And it's a direct reflection, in my opinion, just like what you saw in the 80s of, the influence of the economy and that extra disposable income influencing product differentiation, basically, and increasing the quality. I would consider it quality. And actually, when I was at, it was at Mr. Kimura's nursery, Masahiko Kimura's nursery, a year and a half ago, in January of, what that had been, 2017, I guess. I was up there, I took a tour up there, sat down and talked to him for a while, and he got out a book of photos of trees from China. So he travels to China quite a bit to do business over there. And he'd take photos of some of the trees that were at his clients' homes or on exhibition. And he had a whole group of photos, both conifer and deciduous, but he was really keen on the deciduous trees. He kept flipping through the book and he kept saying, Japan is losing. We're totally losing quality-wise. And the techniques are just amazing here, and the quickness with which they can develop deciduous material and broadleaf material in China, it just blows Japan out of the water. So I was really surprised to hear someone of Mr. Kimura's caliber, talking about Chinese bonsai in that regard. And, nobody in our group was from China. He wasn't trying to impress anybody. It was just his honest opinion. So I thought that was quite fascinating, that his take on it was that the quality level is just shot through the roof. And I would agree with him that in a lot of regards they are moving in a really interesting direction. You see the same thing in Taiwan as well. I mean, Taiwan's economy has gotten better over time. The quality of trees there is just mind blowing at this stage. A lot of their celtis and their other broadleaf and broadleaf deciduous trees are just spectacular. Really, really well done. So I don't know if I would say that it's a mimicking of the Japanese approach to bonsai. I almost think that it's just a natural progression of wanting to produce something that's more difficult to produce so that you can sell it for a higher price because it's rare and people have extra money now to spend on that. So it's just product differentiation. So it just seems like that natural evolution. I could be wrong about that. Maybe in the States that'll never happen. In Europe, it's moved in that direction a little bit, but not as quickly, because I, again, think that has a lot to do with the economy, and Europe's economy isn't in the greatest shape right now, particularly in places where bonsai is most popular. So say like Spain, for example, not the best economic situation in the world. They don't really have the best deciduous material in the world. Their pines and junipers, they've gotten really good at developing those. And there's some other reasons why bonsai is popular in Spain, like, the patronage of the King of Spain and one of the former prime ministers of Spain. They're both interested in bonsai. So that's had a lot to do with the popularity of bonsai rising in Spain. But the economy's not great, so you're not seeing the same type of rapid development, say, with broadleaf trees as you see in China and in other parts of the world. So again, I have no idea if this will manifest itself in the States. Right now, the popular thing is to work with our native Yamadori collectible trees from the mountains in the U.S. Rocky Mountain junipers in particular are crazy popular right now. So people are looking to develop those and doing a really good job, doing it very quickly, turning out some beautiful trees. But in terms of the deciduous material that we have in the States, we have trees, native species that could be developed, just as great as anything you see in China, Japan, anywhere else in the world. They just haven't really been tapped into yet. But it's either going to take one or two people really focusing down and trying to develop that material without really focusing too much on the economic benefit of making something like that, because maybe you'll never make your money back in something like that, which takes 20, 30, 40 years to develop something nice. But I guarantee you, if the U.S. economy started blowing up again in the next 10, 15, 20 years, the quality of deciduous material would blow through the roof. And the quality of bonsai in general in the States would blow through the roof, even faster than what's happening now with what I consider a bit of a boom in bonsai in the U.S. So Could be wrong, but I think that would probably be the case. So we'll just have to see. All right, so that brings us to the end of this episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. Once again, I'm going to try to be better about putting out a podcast every couple of weeks. Still don't know if that's going to be the case because I got to travel a whole lot between now and when we open the nursery in September. As a matter of fact, as soon as I'm done in Brazil, I got to fly straight to Abu Dhabi after this for some bonsai-related stuff. So I'm still on the road quite a bit, but I am going to try my best to put out a podcast every couple of weeks. But again, thank you guys so much for checking this out, sending in your questions. Send them into podcast@bjornbjorholm.com. I'll try to do my best to answer those in a future episode. And thank you for your support. So we will see you guys in the next episode of the Bonsai Network podcast. Take care.